So as you know, we are coming today to the end of our 3G campaign. And over the course of this time, we have been introducing you to our new mission partners that we're going to be in relationship with probably for the next 3 to 4 years as we support them financially, but then also physically by going to them, taking trips, walking along beside them, seeing what God's doing in them and through them, where they are currently at, where they're actually at. And so we want to be involved in that way. And so every time every week we've gathered, we've introduced a new one to you. And the thing I've told you before, if you've been around here for a while, that these are familiar names and faces because this is the first time this ever happened in so far at Hulen Street, at least as far as I know, that every one of our mission partners came from or through Hulen Street Church. They have a relationship with us. They were here as part of us for an extended period of time. So we have great trust and comfort in knowing who they are and what they're about. And so we're excited about partnering with them. And we want to introduce you to our third and final mission partner today. And again, another familiar name, another familiar face. So take a look at this.
Hello, Hulen Street Church. As many of you already know, we're Thomas and Holly Sieberhagen, and we're serving as church planners in the south of Belgium among the French-speaking Belgians. We do a lot of different things here, including planting a church, where I'm a co-pastor along with my teammate. And we also run an arts center in the downtown of our city where we welcome Belgians into our space and where we can meet them, get to know them, and have spiritual conversations with them. But it's not always easy, and we certainly face a lot of challenges. What are some of the challenges we face?
A lot of the challenges are relevance to the culture. Sometimes people just don't see the church as being necessary anymore, Jesus being necessary for salvation of sins. Does sin really exist? We also find that there's a lot of suspicion in our culture, suspicion of religion, suspicion of our arts center anyway. Why are we doing this? What are you doing here, you Americans? And so we face a lot of that. Also, just in general, the culture is very dark. There tends to be people with a lot of depression, a lot of drug addictions, and family issues. And so it's just pushing up against the darkness at all times.
Yeah, we're really thankful that the Lord has led us in the direction that He has, and that we've been able to start two things where we've seen some success, and that the Arts Center in the 2 years since we began it has grown, and our events have become more popular and more well known, but we still have a long way to go. The church as well, we've been really blessed to have Belgian families join the church that have a vision for what we're doing and love the idea and are on board and hungry to grow and help and volunteer. What we're praying is that our church can grow and that more Belgian families will be able to catch the vision and partner with us. Hulen Street is going to be a huge help for us as we look to grow both in our arts center and in our church plant. We are so excited that Hulen Street wants to help us in that way, and we're excited that Hulen Street is going to come and participate in the work. And so we want to ask you to prayerfully consider giving in the one-time donation on November 19th, and which will help support all of the things I've just described. And then would you also pray about joining us next September, the last week of September 2024. Hulen Street is going to come and participate in some of the events in the church plan and in some of the Art Center events. And we would love to see you here with us helping. And it's just a really exciting time for us, a time of growth, a time where we can see lots of potential. And so Hulen Street's partnering with us at a really great time. We love you guys. Thank you so much.
So exciting, and so glad you got to meet Tom and Holly and their cat. And You're like, something, Siebehagen, that name sounds familiar. It's because there's a Siebehagen in our sound booth right now. There's the Siebehagen family sitting here. In fact, if you're a Christian and you probably took, DNA test, you're probably 10% Siebehagen at this point. It's kind of we're almost like one of those weird, like, family culty churches. But not quite. So, no, we love the Siebehagens. They've been a huge part of Hulen Street for a long, long time, and we're excited about serving and supporting Tom and Holly and what they're doing there, because so much of what they're doing, hopefully you'll hear today, and what we're looking at in our future as a church, what we want to be, the things that they're doing, how they're engaging with their culture in really new and creative ways, that's really our heartbeat. We want to do that too, just trying to think about ways, how can we do things a little bit differently, which kind of brings us to our last G of the 3G, and that is getting creative. I want to talk to you about that today, and we're going to talk out of a book called Mark. Almost said Matthew, but Mark chapter 2. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, first 4 books of the New Testament tell the story of the life of Jesus. And I always tell people, if you do not have a regular habit of reading the Bible, I always tell you, a great place to start is actually in the book of Mark. It's a fairly short book, number one. Number two, it's a very action-oriented book. Jesus is always going and doing something. And then the third reason I point people to Mark is because it just connects us to who Jesus is and what Jesus is all about, and you cannot go wrong there. So if that's something that's not really settled in your life, you don't really have that habit of reading and putting in God's word in your life, then Mark chapter 1, verse 1 tomorrow. I really would encourage you to start that. But we're in Mark chapter 2. And in Mark chapter 2 tells a story about Jesus healing a man who was a paralytic. And actually what happens here is that there are 2 miracles that take place. There's one that's invisible and one that is visible. So let's talk about this. So Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 5, kind of jumping into it, he says, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, when Jesus says this, he is saying this in the middle of a crowd. They're in a house that is absolutely packed. We're going to get into that a little bit more later. But he is saying this in front of a group of people, and they've all shown up, right? They're all showed up there. They want to be there. They've packed into this house because of the potential of what they might possibly see. They know who Jesus is, and they know what Jesus can do. Capernaum, where he's at, he's coming to Capernaum. This is kind of his home base, so people are very familiar with him. So when he comes back into town, they want to see something miraculous. They want to see something spectacular. And so when this paralytic is laid at the feet of Jesus, they are certain something big is about to happen. So the room gets quiet and everyone moves to the edge of their seats. And Jesus looks at this guy and says, "Your sins are forgiven." And everybody's like, "And what else are you going to say?" Right? But that's where he stops. And I have to think that probably more than a few of them in that room are just a little disappointed. Because that's not what they came to see. They came to see something big. They came to see something spectacular. They came to see something miraculous, supernatural, right? That's what they want to see. They want to see this guy jump up off his mat, dance a jig in the room, right? Run out the door. Everybody follows him. Like a Bollywood movie, they break out into this huge dance number, and there's confetti cannons and pyrotechnics, and there's a big celebration. That's what they want. But they don't get that. He says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." But here's what's interesting. They didn't understand it at the time, but what Jesus actually did in that moment was far more significant than what they wanted him to do. And Paul says it this way. Paul says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine." When they laid that guy at the feet of Jesus, they had an idea. They wanted him to heal him physically. But Jesus did more than they asked or even than they imagined, because he didn't just heal his body in this story. He begins by healing his soul. Now I want to point out something to you. Some of us in this room, you are dealing with a low-grade disappointment with God. You'll never say it out loud. You don't want to admit it, but some of you are frustrated in your relationship with God. And the reason you're frustrated is because you brought him your problem. You gathered up all of your hurt, you collected all of your issues, and you laid them at his feet. But he didn't do what you expected him to do, and he didn't respond how you wanted him to respond. And if that's you, and you are here today, I want you to hear this. God does not always do what we expect him to do, what we ask him to do, or what we want him to do. But here's what I do know to be true. God always does what we need him to do. Even though we don't expect it or even ask for it, he does what we need him to do. He shows up in the way we need him to show up. And so he says to this man, your sins are forgiven. And many of them in the room that day, they did not understand. But there were those, let me tell you something, there were some in the audience who did understand. There were a few there in that audience that day that understood precisely what Jesus meant. They understood what he was saying. And they understood very clearly that in saying those words, that Jesus was making a very particular claim about himself. And they did not like it. Not one bit. Look at verse 6. He says, now some of the teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So there's this inner dialogue that we catch a glimpse of these guys. They're unhappy. Jesus has just said something that's very, very offensive to them because they know only God can forgive sin. Only God has the ability to forgive sin. Only God has the authority to forgive sin. And Jesus has just said that this guy's sins are forgiven. And they're kind of communicating this, they're by the scowls on their faces and their sideways, angry glances. And Jesus knows this. Jesus has that ability. We've talked about this before. He can perceive into the hearts of men. He knows what's happening, what they're thinking, what they're dealing with, how they're struggling. And he's able to speak into that. He's able to address exactly where they are. And so what he does is he asks a question into the room. He knows this is what's on their heart, so he throws a question out into the room. And he says, which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? What he's saying is it easier to heal someone who is sick, or is it easier to raise someone from the dead? Because that's what he did when he forgave his sin. And he's saying to them, listen, what I did for this man when I forgave his sins, when I said his sins are forgiven, what I did may not have been visible, but it was definitely much more significant and harder. He knows, because he knows what it's going to take in order to make that forgiveness a reality. And so he continues, and he says in verse 10, he says, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says, so you'll know, I want you to be clear that I am who I say I am by doing the things that only God can do. That's the reason we have miracles. Miracles aren't just there for entertainment purposes. They're not just there just to make someone physically better. Everybody that Jesus physically healed eventually died. You realize that, right? They all eventually died. And so even though he healed them, they still eventually died because, listen, that healing was always temporary. What he came to do, which was far more significant, far more important, was the healing not of the body but of the soul. Not just a temporary healing, but a permanent healing, a forever healing, an eternal healing. That's what he came to actually provide. But in doing so, he had to say, listen, you need to understand, I have this authority. I am who I say I am, and I want you to know, I can do only the things that God can do because I am God. And so just so you'll know, so I can prove it to you yet again, I'm going to do this for you. And he said to the paralytic, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. And he got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of all of them. And I love how this ends. This amazed everyone. And they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. I love this moment. I love it for kind of like the moment that Jesus gets to have. Like he's got his enemies are there. They're not really haven't presented themselves. They're not really attacking him out loud, but they're kind of looking at him and they're very suspicious of him and they're angry with him and he's not who they want him to be. And he just basically says, guys, let me show you what I'm all about. And it is a classic mic drop moment that we all would love to have. And Jesus gets it right there. And that's the end of the story. But there's more to the story, and to understand the whole of what we're getting to today, we need to go back to the beginning. Verse 1. A few days later, Jesus again entered Capernaum. This is his home base. The people heard that he had come home. So many gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. I want you to imagine this. Jesus comes back into town, and word spreads quickly, neighbor to neighbor, down the street, around the well, while they're in the market talking to one another. Jesus is back. Jesus was home. No announcement was made. No invitation was given, yet they came anyway. They set aside the day's tasks. They laid down their tools. They hung up their aprons, and they came to the door of the house. And when they did, no one was turned away. Everyone was welcome, and as the word spread, the crowd grew until they're sitting on the floor, and they're leaning on the walls, and they're standing in the doorways, and they're looking in through windows stacked 2, 3, maybe even 4 deep. And if you were in the crowd that day, you would say that there was probably nothing spectacular or significant about his appearance. He didn't really look like much, but when he opened his mouth and began to speak, it was so clear that he was not like anyone they had ever encountered. And everyone in that house, packed in that hot, stuffy house, sat there in silence as he preached the word to them. And there they are, standing on tiptoes, craning their necks, turning their heads just so they can hear. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but no one complained. They didn't mind. They just stood there drinking in every word from his mouth as if it was life itself, because, funny enough, it was. And then the story says that some men, bringing to him a paralytic, carried by 4 of them. All right, so these 4 guys show up, and they're carrying a guy who's been paralyzed, probably since birth. And they are carrying him on a mat. We'll see this in a moment. So I love these guys. When you kind of get into the story, these are guys that I really want to be friends with, that I have a heartbeat with, because when they heard that Jesus was in town, you know what their first thought was? The first thought wasn't, I need to go get a seat. They said, Jesus is in town, and their first thought, their first reaction was, I got a friend who needs to be there. I've got someone who needs to hear this. So their first thought isn't to grab a seat. Their first thought is to bring a friend. And we don't know how or when, we don't really know the backstory, but I think we can assume that there was a moment in the lives of these 4 men where they actually outgrew their desire just simply to be a part of the audience. They knew Jesus was in town, but they were no longer content just to sit in the crowd and listen to him talk about the kingdom of God. They now wanted to participate in it. So instead of hurrying ahead to find a spot where they can sit, they doubled back so they could pick up a friend. You know, I love moments like this. I love challenging us in moments like this, through campaigns like this, because what does it do? It forces us to take a hard look. It forces us to re-examine our priorities. It forces us to reevaluate our values. It forces us to just think about what's really important and to recognize that there's nothing more significant than be a part of what God is doing in the world through his church. And I think it's through these moments where we put the challenge out there. We kind of unapologetically just challenge you to step into that role, step into that next thing. So that's when the light goes on for some of us. That's when we finally make that transition and we get out of the stands and we step out onto the field. And that's awesome and it's exciting and there's a lot of enthusiasm that comes with that. But let me tell you something. That's usually when things start to get hard and difficult. Because look at verse 4. Since they could not get to him, they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd. So they bring their friend and they're excited about it. Think about it. They're holding a corner of the mat, walking as quickly as they can, trying to get to Jesus. They're making their way through the town, imagining what's about to happen. They're so excited about what this moment holds for their friend, how things are going to be changed forever. And then they turn the corner and they see the house, and reality comes crashing down. Because when they arrive, winded and sweating, what do they find? They see a crowd pressing in at the doors, leaning into the windows. They can look into the openings and see that it is packed, people spilling out into the street. Everyone is trying to get as close to Jesus as they can. And they know immediately there is no way these 4 guys with this mat are going to get through that crowd. They are not getting into the house today. And this is the moment where they look at each other and they think, this isn't going to be as easy as we thought. It never is. You know, this is an exciting time in the life of our church. And let me just say, let's be honest about it. It's a time of challenge. This is a time of transition. And I'm thinking about what we've been talking about in the last few weeks, what we're going to talk about today, about what we want to do, not just with our mission partners, but what we want to do here at Hulen Street Church for the community of Fort Worth, how we want to get creative here and there. And let me tell you something. The things that we have gone through were not on my radar when we started these plans. And so there's a temptation, right? There's a temptation. You think about all these great things. 3G has been in the works for months, and then suddenly it gets real hard, and you have this temptation just to set the mat down and walk away. But we can't. We can't because the stakes are just too high. So yeah, the excitement and the enthusiasm, it'll carry us forward for a while, but then it's going to get hard, and it is getting hard, and I recognize that. I recognize this is not an easy time, but guys, it's still an exciting time, and I'm still so excited and optimistic about what is coming to Hulen Street Church. And yeah, there are going to be changes around here, and there are going to be new people on staff, and it's going to upset the status quo, and we're going to feel like we're losing our place, and things are going to feel different, and but that's just going to be a part of it. But it's when those times happen, we're all going to be tempted. Are we going to set down the mat, or are we going to just find another way? And that's exactly what they did. See, they could either give up, or they could get creative. And they got creative. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, look at this. They made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. Right? We could either set the mat down and go, sorry, man, we tried. It's just the obstacles are too big, right? The problems are just too great. The challenges are just too much. We really didn't want to get you in there, but we don't find a way, right? We can't see a way forward. So we could either lay down the mat, or what if we maybe tear a hole in the roof? And so one of them has to who was the first one that suggested this? Like there's 4 of them around the mat. They're looking at it going, man, what are we going to do? One goes, well, we could put a hole in the roof. I like how you're thinking. And that's exactly what they did. We look at this, though, and we kind of laugh. And we look at these guys from the perspective of where we are on the timeline. We're looking back. We're looking back from our perspective in history. But I want you just for a moment, just pretend you were in that room that day, and these guys start coming through the ceiling. And I think we shouldn't fool ourselves. Their efforts initially were probably not well received. And you know what? That's common. When you get creative and you start challenging the status quo, you start doing things a little differently, you're not always going to be well received. And why is that? Well, because what you're going to do, like these guys, is going to be disruptive. They were incredibly disruptive. Think about it. Crowded room. Everyone is settled in. They'd all found their spots. They're all sitting there in silence, listening to the lesson, right? Hearing the teacher. Everything was progressing as expected until they're sitting there and they hear the first dull thump of imagine what would have been maybe a spade or a shovel of some kind of tool just hitting the roof. And it was harder to ignore when the dust began to fall and the plaster filled the air, and the guys on the roof, as they made progress, the sound got louder, and then these little cracks began to appear in the ceiling, and they just got bigger, and then suddenly it just all is off the rails when a first little thin shaft of sunlight, golden bright sunlight, shoots through the ceiling and crashes into the floor at Jesus' feet. And they finally punch through into the room. Maybe the people in the room tried to ignore the distraction, hoping that whoever was on the roof would just eventually give up, realize how stupid it was, how crazy it was to try to dig through a roof. But when they finally broke through that ceiling, it became clear that the lesson that they had come for, what they were expecting, what they had elbowed their way into the room for, that was over. And now their whole plan, their expectation, their wants, right, had been completely disrupted. This was not what they expected, and it was certainly not what they wanted or what they showed up for, because these guys disrupted their plans. And listen, we're going to do something that I hope is going to be disruptive. I want it to be disruptive to us. I want it to be disruptive to Fort Worth in the best possible way. I want it to be disruptive to other churches in Fort Worth. Some of the things we're going to be thinking about doing. But listen, when you're disruptive, you're not. Not everybody's going to respond in a positive way, and I'm ready for that. So it's disruptive, but you know what? It's also just literally destructive. You know what they're doing? They're committing a crime. They're committing a crime. I talked to John Quintana. John Quintana, if you guys know him, he's one of Fort Worth's finest. I texted him the other day, like, hey, I'm teaching this, and these guys, they dig a hole in the roof that wasn't theirs. I don't think they asked permission. If you were to do that today, what would that be called? Are you breaking the law? And he says, yes, it's called criminal mischief. These guys are committing criminal mischief. So to tear a hole in the roof of a house that does not belong to you, it's a pretty bold move, and it's a risky move. And here's why. You start tearing a hole in the roof of a house, you know what that means? It means you are all in. There's no going back. And it's destructive, right? And so here's the thing. What are we going to destroy around here? Right? We're not going to, we have people trying to cut into the sprung all the time, But what is it that we're actually going to attempt to dismantle? Well, the things we have to ask ourselves are this. What are the customs and the habits? What are the rituals and the practices that we have gotten so used to, that we find some comfort in, but yet they stand in the way of someone trying to come to faith? Here's the thing that we always have to, and not just now, but forever, we always have to be on our guard and ask ourselves, what are the walls of tradition that we have to be willing to tear down in order to bring someone just closer to Jesus? I don't know if you know this or not. You might have seen this. You walk down the hall, the growth group hall here on the west wing there. At the end of the hall is the door that leads into the staff offices, and you walk through that door. If you're looking ahead, there's a big poster on the wall, a big frame poster with Acts 15:19 there on the wall, and it says, we should not make it difficult for those who are turning to God. We should not make it difficult. And I put it there because I wanted the staff and anybody really who's walking down that hall, when they walk into those offices, I wanted the staff and all of us to see that over and over again and to realize that's our goal here. That's what we're trying to do. We should not make it difficult, but churches are famous for making it difficult, because we construct these rituals and ceremonies and traditions that we fall in love with, but they just become barriers to people coming to faith. I know some of that makes us real uncomfortable, like, oh my gosh, I don't know, I'm a little insecure in that. What do you mean by that? What are we going to tear down? Listen, understand, there are non-negotiables that will never go away, that we will never compromise on. There are hills we will always, always die on. But outside of that, everything's up for grabs. Everything's up for grabs. Let me tell you how significant this is. You know when those words were spoken? That was spoken by James at the end of a very contentious debate, because there was a question. If these Gentiles were coming to faith in Jesus, didn't they have to become Jews in order to become Christians? Right? Because that's what we had to do. right? Do they need to be circumcised like we would? Did they have to go through this system, right? So did they have to take the first step of becoming Jewish in order to take the second step of becoming Christians? And that was a big debate among the early church. How far do we go? What do we do? And they all got together and they said what? No, we should not make it difficult. And you know what they're saying there? They are setting aside hundreds, if not thousands of years of tradition that these guys grew up in. They lived and breathed this world. And they said, no, we are not going to make it difficult for anyone to come to faith. And so they don't have to jump through our hoops in order to get to Jesus. And guys, we have to be so careful because we have so many well-meaning hoops that we ask people to jump through in order to find Jesus. And we've fallen in love with those ceremonies and rituals and traditions. But we have to be willing to hold on loosely to them and sometimes even to destroy them. So getting creative like these guys did, it's disruptive to the status quo. It's destructive to things some people hold very, very dear, which also means it's going to be offensive. Let me tell you something. Man, I've been here 13 years now. And I don't mean just us. I mean just as a culture. I don't think I've ever experienced a time we have been more fearful or more fragile as believers. There is so much pearl clutching and hand wringing going on over secondary issues, tertiary things. They're not the primary issue. There's the secondary things. But we live in a world where there's no such thing. Everything's primary. Everything's primary. You can't live in that world. That's not reality, guys. But we get so wound up over all the secondary issues, and we lose sight of the primary things. And we got to be willing. We got to be willing to be offensive sometimes. Not to the people we're trying to reach, but even the people who are already reached. Because here's what I've found is the people who know Jesus, sometimes they're the most offended by things that we will try to do. And we have to be asking ourselves the question, are we willing to do the things that no one else thought about doing? Are we willing to do the things that no one else was willing to do? Are we willing to do the things that will make people shake their heads and roll their eyes and maybe even laugh? Are we willing to challenge the status quo? Are we willing as a church to be so committed to our mission that we're willing to be questioned and criticized and even ridiculed? Are we willing to put a hole in the roof for people to meet Jesus? See, it's disruptive, it's destructive, it's offensive, and let me tell you, here's the last part. It's expensive. Let me tell you something, when those guys put that spade against the roof and they started tearing that thing open, they know that they're now in. They're gonna have to pay for this, and they're gonna pay probably financially, but there's a good chance they're gonna pay socially. But you know what? They're so willing to pay the price. And why are they so willing to pay the price? Because they are utterly convinced that this man, their friend, his only option is Jesus. Jesus is the only solution. And let me tell you something, when you are so convinced that Jesus is the only solution to the world's problems, you will move heaven and earth and tear whatever roof off that you need to get people there. But here's the problem. I think there are a lot of people that just don't want to pay the price. They don't want to pay the financial price. They don't want to pay the emotional price. They don't want to pay the reputation price of doing something crazy. I came across a podcast this last weekend, and Erwin McManus, who's a pastor in LA for years and years and years, and he was talking about taking chances and risking some things. And he says most of the time when we keep hitting a ceiling and hitting a ceiling and hitting a ceiling that we can't break through, I love this. He says it's because we really don't want to go to the other side. I think there's a lot of, and listen, I'm not trying to throw stones at any other church. I think I've dealt with this. I've struggled with this. This is why this resonated so much with me, because what does it take to go to the other side? It's expensive. He says this, because it requires too much risk, too much sacrifice, too much uncertainty, too much change, or too much emotional energy. So let's just kind of play it safe and keep it in this, keep it right here. We're all good. The doors are open. The lights are on. We feel good every Sunday. And we'll just kind of cruise along at this point from now until Jesus gets back. And I don't want to do that. I don't think any of you want to do that either. So they were willing to pay that price. They were willing to do what it took. You know why? Because they were utterly convinced that Jesus was the only solution to their friend's situation. So it was disruptive and destructive and a little offensive and for sure expensive. But guys, that's what it takes to sometimes be creative. And I want to be creative. We were created in the image of a God who creates. And when we are creative, we reflect that image. And I want to do that. I want to do that with you. There's a part of this, these guys, they were willing to do this. You know why? Because they weren't alone. They were together. There were 4 of them. They did it in a community. They tore a hole in the roof. And no, there wasn't one of them that stood out among the others. They did it together, and that's why they did it at all, is because they did it together. If we do anything at all, guys, it's because we did it together. So what do we want to do? What is the creative thing we want to do in 2024? We want to start a 3rd service. You're like, wow. I'm not sure that's too creative. Lots of churches have 3rd services. You're right, they do. But no one in Fort Worth has a 3rd service on a Thursday night. But we will. We're going to have a 3rd service. Yeah. We're going to have a 3rd service on a Thursday night. Why on a Thursday night? Because there is a segment of our population who cannot get here on Sunday. There are people who are working in hospitality industry, healthcare, first responders, any kind of shift work. They are just unable to be a part. Listen, we're not adding a 3rd service because we need the room. There are plenty of chairs. We don't add a 3rd service in order to make room. We're adding a 3rd service for a whole different audience of people who we cannot reach without it. That's what we want to do. Because there are people out there who just can't get here at this time. So they need a church with an untraditional schedule because they are living with untraditional schedules. And we want to accommodate that and give them a way in. So we're going to start a Thursday night service, and we're going to do it when? We're going to start in February. In fact, February 1st. Here's how you're going to remember that. We're calling it 3, 2, 1. We're going to have a 3rd service on February 1st. You know what occurred to me? Some of you who are still here then, you remember when we added the 2nd service? Does anybody remember that campaign? What was it called? Anybody? 2, 2, 2. 2 services on February 2nd. I was on a run one day, and we'd already picked February 1st, and I thought, whoa, wait a minute, 3, 2, 1. Of course, this is what we do. We have to do this now. It doesn't matter if it's a terrible idea or not. 3, 2, 1, we're stuck. We're going for it. Is it a good idea? I have no idea. Let me be honest with you. I have no idea. We live in a world in which church is very much locked into traditional times. So what we're going to have to do between now and February is we're going to have to educate the people of Fort Worth that there is a time for them to come and be a part of Hulen Street Church. That to think differently about how we can convince them to consider a time of worship that they've never considered before. That's our big obstacle. And we're going to do everything that we can to tell people that story and bring them here on a Thursday night. We're going to need your help. We're going to need your help just to talk about it. We're going to need your help to spread the word. But we're also going to need your help as a launch team. We're going to need ushers and greeters. We're going to need seat fillers. It may not be your service, but you still need to come and be a part of it just to have people to connect with and talk with. There's a lot of different things. There are so many logistics and decisions that we are still working through right now, but here's what we know. It's happening, and on February 1st, it's gonna start. There are a lot of questions between now and then we still need to answer, but we do feel good in our direction. That's what we're going to do. That's why we're going to do it, and we need your help for it.